Hi everyone, my name is Lukas Kölz. I'm one of the artists here at Mind Games Interactive, and this video is going to be a short tutorial about our landscape material that we see in the viewport right here. We released a short entry on our dev blog last week. Actually, our dev blog, if you want to take a look, it's sanethegame.net. We share a lot of information about the game we're currently working on, and one of that is that breakdown that we shared. We had a lot of people requesting a video tutorial for it, so that's what this is going to be. It's probably going to end up a multi-part tutorial. First part is going to cover the basic material creation and how to create a layer for it. And the second part is going to cover how to add the puddles on top of it. And I'm not sure yet where I'm going to add the tessellation. The strong parts about this material, let me give you a quick rundown of what's going on here, is that we have multiple materials blending on top of each other using a height map and procedural puddles that get layered on top of all of that. We have displacement. So if you take a look at our wireframe, it's really dense. That's because we're using dynamic tessellation. You can see how it fades out. Ignore the yellow lines. That's just skybox in the background. So if you get closer, you can see how the grid gets finer. That's the tessellation at work. And we of course are also displacing that based on the terrain height map. So let me quickly demonstrate. Of course the blending works as you would expect it to do to work. Put in a value of 1, so actually something's changing. Let's paint in some mud. And for the puddles, you can of course remove them. And then we can add them in again. And as you can see, I can just paint them in and they conform to the underlying height map. So I don't have to worry about, well, where should I place puddles? It's just drag and drop painting them on top. And then we have quite a few settings in our material instance that we can use to influence these. So you can see we have the basic settings for roughness and tiling of the different materials, and then we have some settings for tessellation. And this is the interesting part, the puddles. We have of course the puddle size, so if we increase this, actually makes them smaller. It's a bit backwards. We might change that in this tutorial. And then the other way around, we can increase the size of these puddles, which is really cool. And we also have a color, which is linked in the depth opacity. So if I change this, you can see the color changing on the dirt, on the puddles. And let me just leave it a crazy color like that so that I can show you what the depth does. Because this one basically just defines how much of it is gonna get this color. So when a puddle is deeper, it usually ends up being harder to see through. So we change the color. And the opacity is basically the same thing, just not depending on the distance between the surface and the terrain underneath it, the height. Well, it's basically just working with the texture, right? But you get the idea. So let's change the spec to a reasonable color. And let's get started. So let me change my mode. I can actually select something. And let's do this over from scratch. So creating a new material, calling it landscape material, and I call it tutorial. So just so that I know what's going on here. Let's open that up. So first thing we're going to change is we're going to click in an empty area, going to scroll down to our usage, and make sure we're selecting used with landscape. Save this. Any of these saving or loading or compiling processes are gonna take really long. I'm just gonna cut the video real quick. So, and now to actually see something on this material, let's bring in some textures. Already prepared some. I'm just gonna use the same ones I used for this material. This is actually more textures than are actually used, but for now let's just take our dirt layers. So bring in your textures, just like that. And I'll give you a quick run through for how these textures are set up. This is a albedo texture or a color texture, and that's basically all it is. That's actually not completely true because an albedo texture wouldn't have any shadow information, and as you can see, there is some ambient occlusion information in here. That's just because that's basically an artistic choice because I like to cheat a little. We found that the ambient occlusion slot in the material in Unreal, well, it's only supposed to work on static lighting, and on the side it doesn't receive light, but we find it does almost nothing. So what we end up doing is bake some of that ambient occlusion right in our albedo map, making kind of a diffuse map, I guess. But we are very careful about it. It's more like putting the curvature with a really low opacity on top of that, so that we get a good balance, I guess, that doesn't look off in game under different lighting conditions. But you might want to avoid that if you're going for a true albedo map. Then we have a normal map, and that's a pure normal map. Make sure it's set to normal map in the compression settings. Unreal should do this automatically, but just make sure it is. And then this one is interesting. You can set this up in a different way, but the way we have it is we combine three textures in one. We use the channels. So in the red channel we have our roughness. In the green channel we have our height map information. And in the blue channel we have our ambient occlusion and some curvature laid on top of it. And for a texture like this, where you put different textures in different channels, make sure you set your compression settings to masks. Otherwise it's going to use sRBG compression, and that's going to mess it up. So what we're going to do now is real basic. Put the color in the base color, normal map in the normal map, and then for these masks, that's where it gets a little bit interesting. We have our roughness in the red channel, if you remember. We could just plug this into the roughness, but what I'd like to do is use a lerp node, linear interpolate, use it as an alpha, and use two constants between 1 and 0, and put that in the roughness. Later on, we can convert these into parameters and then adjust our roughness value, our max and min roughness value, between which we lerp with that alpha in runtime while we actually see the material, which is really handy, I think. Then we have our height map in the green channel. We're just gonna ignore that for now. And we have our ambient occlusion in the blue channel. So another thing that's really important here is actually mapping this material to our landscape properly. What we're gonna do for that is we need to set up some UVs. We're gonna use the world position. So absolute world position. Make sure you don't put absolute in your search, because it's not gonna give you the result. You need to put in world position. And from this node, what we're gonna do is we're gonna multiply it. And if you haven't used the material editor in Unreal all that much, the way I get these nodes, it's just pressing and holding 1 and then pressing on the canvas. If you do this with the number keys from 1 to 3, you get 1, 2, and 3 vectors. So let's put our tiling to 1 and just plug this into the UVs. Oh yeah, right. So multiplying our absolute world position with 1 is something we just do so that we can adjust tiling of our textures with a parameter. And it's gonna give me an error because I actually forget one step. This actually gives us a 3 vector, this node, and we only need 2 vectors for our UVs. So let's just use a component mask for the RNG channel and do it like this. Now the error should be gone. Cool. Let's convert this one to a parameter. Let's call it tiling. And then let's save all of this. This might take a moment because it needs to compile the shaders. There we go. And now let's actually take a look at our work. Actually, let's create a material instance of our material so that we can adjust our parameter, apply it to the landscape, and it's just gonna end up a brown mess. That's my guess. Let's take a look. And like I said, it's a brown mess. And that's because our tiling is probably way too high at a value of 1. So let's put in something like this. Perfect. Nailed it on the first try. Now I knew the tiling value from the other material I set up before. So now we can actually see our landscape properly. This is already looking rather nice. Of course, the result here is going to depend on your textures and your textures alone. And what we're going to do now is add more material layers to this. So let's put this right here and go in here. We could just go in and add our other textures the same way and then blend it. But what I like to do to kind of leave this in a clean state is use material functions as material layers and then blend them. This also makes it easier to set it up. So back in our content browser, let's create a new folder. And let's call this material layers. I already have one like that because this material is already set up, so I call it tutorial. Now in here, so right click, materials and textures, material function. And let's call this dirt material layer, and I call it tutorial. So this is going to be on our material layer. Let's open that up. That's what it looks like. If you haven't worked with material functions before, they always give outputs, and that's just a node like that. And what we're gonna do now is just go into our material that we already set up, take all of this, Control C to copy it, Control V to paste it. So what we want to do is ignore the output result for now. What we want to do now is take our color and get a make material attributes node. That looks more like what we're used to from the usual material editor. So we have our base color, we have our normal map, we have our roughness, and then we can plug this make material attributes into our output result. Something else we need to change is we want all our material layers to be influenced by this part right here. So what we're going to do is get rid of this node and instead, or actually, let's leave it there, but let's get an input. So if we search for input, we get a function input. It's not like that. That's what we want. This is basically just, these are going to end up as input pins in our material layer, where we can put information right into here. And you can change, if you have the node selected, if it's a scalar, 2 vector, 3 vector, or texture and so on. 3 vector. Actually, we only need a 2 vector because we just want the UV coordinates. So let's put this in here, just as a preview value so that we can actually see over here what's going on. Will have no effect whatsoever on the actual material. And if you want to, you can use this as a preview value as default. Then it's not going to give you any errors when you don't have anything connected to this input. But I always want to have something connected, and I want the engine to remind me if I missed to do so. So I leave this empty. And then we plug this back into our multiply. So why I'm still connecting this to a multiply with our tiling is so that I can tile the material independently of the overall tiling of the whole landscape material. We actually don't need this mask anymore, because this already is a 2-vector now. And what I would like to do now is set up some more of these outputs. So for the metallic, we don't really need the 0. I just like to do it because it reminds me of what's going on. And then I like to add another one for the specular. This one is gonna be 0.5 though. And since this is a material function, we can't just convert this to a parameter as we would normally do in a material. We need another input. Let's create a function input. Let's put this as a preview. Let's use the preview as default value. And actually, let's get rid of it completely and put this value in right here. This is a scalar value. And our specular. Also, let's name it that way. So now we have our specular set up and can change this later on. Specular of 0.5 should be fine for almost any material, but just to make sure, I like to add it this way. Now we need to add more inputs for our roughness, and I just like to copy this one, place it once, call it roughness. This is our minimum roughness. It's also default at 0. Places this node. Let's copy this, paste it. This time it's our roughness max. And it's at 1. Let's replace this value right here. And now we have our roughness set up and can change it on the material function. Let's connect our ambient occlusion. And for our heightmap value, which is in the green channel of this mask texture right here, we could use our world displacement, which is where it's going to end up with. But what I found is that using the world displacement doesn't work that well with what I want to do with this value, because I like to use this as masks for blending these textures and also for the procedural puddles. And using the world displacement node, I'm not really sure what the make material attributes does to this value, but I think it converts it to a free vector. It doesn't stay a scalar parameter. So what I like to do is I like to create another output, a function output, of course. So we get another output result like this one. Let's call this one height. And let's plug it right in there. So now we actually keep this scalar value and it doesn't get converted to anything. We know what's going on with it. It's just a separate output. Okay, that's everything we need to do in this material. So let's save it. Can actually close this. And now let's take this material layer we just created and drag and drop it into our material, our landscape material. As you can see, did we set it up properly? I think so. We have our in for our UV coordinates. We have our roughness set up and our specular. Actually, we missed one thing, so let's double click it to go in there. Our tiling is still a parameter, and of course we need an input. So let's add another input, call it tiling. Set this to 1. And let's plug it into here. And while we're at it, we might as well just call this UVs, so it doesn't just say in. Save it. And for some reason, sometimes these don't update. So let's get rid of it. Just drag and drop it in there one more time. There we go. Now we have the tiling, and these are called UVs with our height and our material outputs. That's what we wanted. So let's take our UVs and plug them in here. Don't need the mask. And let's create some parameters. So the first one is gonna be the Specula, which if we hover over it, we can actually see the default value that we set up, and we want to have the same thing. And let me just place this, copy and place it. We have our roughness min at 0. Oh, changed both of them. Oh, so we need to change the name first, or it's gonna change the value of both of them. I think I have a typo here in roughness. Please ignore it. Which is 0. Plug it in here. Let's copy and paste it. Now our roughness, I have to name it first. Roughness max at 1. Look, put it in there. And finally our tiling. And for this, we actually need to have a group, because we already have a tiling over here. Let's put these into the same group. Let's create a group for this one too. Let's call this one main. Oh, I guess I actually need individual names for these, even if they're in different groups. So let's call this tiling dirt. Let's set up these the same way. Let's call them dirt. Just so they have individual names and won't override each other when we have more layers in here. There we go. Now we can actually go in there and remove all of this, because we won't need it anymore. Take our landscape material, and if we click this, we can actually use material, set it to use material attributes over here. It kind of gets compressed into this one node. You can just plug it in like that. Apply this. And save it. This might take a moment because it needs to compile the shaders. There we go. And now if we take a look at our material, it's still working, which means we did everything right. So we now have a material layer instead of the whole setup right here, and that's plugged into our material attribute. Now let's go in there and create another layer. And for that, I'm just gonna copy or duplicate this layer, and let's call it mud. So let's open our mud layer. Let's replace these textures. Since I have them in the same directory, I'm just gonna browse for them in the content browser. And somewhere in here, I should have my mud, dirt, grass, mud. There it is. Let's take these and drag and drop them in here. So, and Let's rewire these pins. If you didn't know, if you just hold Control while dragging them, you don't lose them. So holding Control, drag and drag them over here, over here. Basically just replacing all of these textures at the moment. Not changing anything else. There we go. Created a separate material layer for our mud. And now we can go in there and take our mud material layer, drag and drop that into our landscape material. Put the UVs back in here. Also, let's comment this a little bit, just to keep it clean. So comment shortcut C on the keyboard. Let's call this UVs. Let's call this dirt. And let's copy all of these, because we have the same parameters. And let's rename them to mud. Change the group. And let's plug them into the inputs. Let's comment it. Mud. And now we're getting to the interesting part, which is adding a blend. So we want a landscape layer blend. And it doesn't have any inputs because we don't have any layers set up over here. So let's add 3 layers actually. And why 3 layers if we only have 2 at the moment? I'm gonna explain that in a second. Let's name the second one dirt, the third one mud, and the first one do not use. Why do we set it up like that? Because if we're using a lot of layers, and you shouldn't do that, but if you do, at some point Unreal is gonna stop compiling this material, and it's gonna give us errors when we paint in the different material layers. So if we want to use a lot of layers, we need to set this up in a way that, I guess, it kind of tricks Unreal, but whatever, it works. So this first layer, do not use, is gonna use a alpha blend. And the second one, our dirt layer, which is gonna be our base, is using a weight blend. Just make sure one of your other layers is using a weight blend, or you're gonna get black areas on your material. And the third one is gonna be a height blend. And all of the other layers we're gonna add on top are also gonna be height blended. Like I said, just make sure you have one layer that's not going to be used with an alpha blend, and one layer that's having a weight blend, so that you don't get any black splotches, because this is just gonna use all of it. Actually, let's input a preview weight of 1 on our dirt layer. And now let's take the result right here, put it into our dirt. And let's use the result over here and put it into our mud. And let's use the height, put it into the height for our mud. We needed a separate height node for our mud, because this one is going to be height blended. We can take the result and plug that into our material attributes. Let's apply this. Oh, and something that I forgot, if you're going to use a layer blend with a lot of different layers, and you're going to use tessellation and stuff, like I said, you might end up getting compiling errors or just the material not compiling at all if you use too many layers on a single patch of the landscape. And to avoid that, we need this do not use layer, and also in our material function, let's go in here, on our texture samples, we need to change the sampler source. At the moment it's from texture asset. Let's select all of these. Let's change it to shared wrap. It's gonna make sure that they're still compiling. Let's save this. And we need to do this for all our material layers. So also do the same thing for the mud layer. There we go. Now, this is compiling a lot of shaders, so I'm gonna save this, and I'm probably going to cut this section out of the tutorial. So while this is still compiling, we can actually go back in here and go into our landscape properties. Also, if you haven't created a landscape yet, you actually should do so. Sorry. So let's get rid of this landscape and let's start this over, right? Because I actually haven't shown that. So on the landscape, we can create a new one. We can actually select our layer, our landscape material already. And my computer's chugging for some reason. There we go. Put that in here. You can select how big you want it. Something like this should be fine for our purposes. And now let's create it. Okay, so under paint, you should see these three layers that do not use, dirt and mud layer, but they still don't have any target layer information. It still says none. So we need to create some. So click this little plus icon. And for the do not use layer, we want non-weight blended. And then just put this in whichever folder you want it. I have it in this one. Do not use layer input, it's fine. I might want to remove this exclamation mark. I'm not sure if it's going to cause any problems, so I remove it. And for dirt, we basically do the same thing, but this is going to be weight blended. I'm really sorry for all these. Like this looks really messy, but this is our whole game, right? So there's a little bit more to that. And then the same for the mud, also weight blended. There we go, we have all three of them created. And now this do not use layer, we're just gonna ignore it forever. Dirt layer, you can paint that of course. And for the dirt layer, what we want to do, we actually want to paint all of it. And since there is no flood option, we're just gonna do it the brute force way. Take a really big brush and just paint all of it. Let's get back in here. And the big change in color is because of the post-process volume that I have set up around here. If you were wondering what's going on there. And now we should be able to paint them some mud. And we are. Let's remove this fall off. There we go. And this is also already height blended. So it's amazing. That's exactly what we wanted. And that's actually everything for this part of the tutorial. In the next part, we're gonna add puddles on top of this that are going to be completely procedural. And we're also gonna add some tessellation so that we get those nice height differences. Tessellation based on the distance to the camera, and of course it's gonna displace the geometry depending on the height map that we already set up. Be sure to let me know in the comments if you didn't understand something or if you have more questions. Also, if you have ideas how to improve these videos, because this is gonna have another part and we're probably gonna create more tutorials as we go along. And Be sure to like and subscribe if you liked the video or if you're interested in seeing the second part in the series. And I guess that's it for now. So see you then. Bye bye.